David Rodriguez was 28 years old and felt like his whole world was falling apart. He worked as a computer programmer in Seattle, spending most of his days fixing code and drinking too much coffee. 3 weeks ago, his girlfriend, Amy, had packed her bags and left their apartment. She said he never really talked to her anymore, that he was always lost in his own thoughts. "You're like a robot sometimes, David," she had said while standing at the door with her suitcase. "I need someone who actually wants to share their life with me." That hurt more than he wanted to admit. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had become too comfortable being alone, even when he wasn't actually alone. Work wasn't going any better. His boss had just rejected his latest project idea, a new app he'd been working on for months during his free time. "Not innovative? Enough," the boss had said without even looking up from his phone. David had put his heart into that project, staying up late for weeks to perfect every detail. So there he was on a cold Thursday evening in November, walking around the Pike Place, area with no real destination in mind. The rain was coming down in that annoying Seattle way. Not quite heavy enough for an umbrella, but steady enough to make everything damp and miserable. He pulled his jacket tighter and kept walking. He'd lived in this neighborhood for almost 6 years, but somehow he found himself standing in front of a shop he'd never noticed before. It was squeezed between Tony's coffee house and a vintage clothing store called Retro Dreams. The strange thing was, David walked this exact street at least twice a week to get to his favorite lunch spot. How had he never seen this place? The shop had a wooden sign that read "Ancient Wonders" in faded gold letters. The windows were covered with a thin layer of condensation, making it hard to see inside clearly. But he could make out shelves filled with what looked like old books, strange sculptures, and various shiny objects. David stood there for a moment, feeling oddly drawn to go inside. He wasn't usually the type to browse random antique shops. His apartment was pretty minimal, just the basics he needed for work and sleep. But something about this place felt different. Maybe it was just because he needed a distraction from his thoughts. A small bell chimed as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside of the shop was warm and smelled like old books mixed with something he couldn't quite identify. Maybe incense or herbs. The lighting was dim, coming mostly from a few old-fashioned lamps scattered around the room. "Welcome! Welcome!" called out a voice from behind the counter. The shopkeeper was an elderly man with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had a slight accent that David couldn't place, maybe European or perhaps Middle Eastern. "Please look around. Everything here has a story." David nodded politely and started wandering through the narrow aisles. The shop was bigger than it looked from outside, with shelves that seemed to go back further than should have been possible. There were old maps, carved wooden masks, crystals in various colors, and books written in languages he didn't recognize. In one corner, he found a display case filled with jewelry. Most of it looked pretty expensive. Ornate necklaces with precious stones, elaborate bracelets, and rings that sparkled under the lamplight. But one piece caught his attention immediately. It was a simple ring sitting by itself on a small black velvet cushion. At first glance, it looked like it was made of some kind of dark metal, maybe titanium or tungsten. But as David looked closer, he noticed it seemed to have a very faint shimmer to it, like oil on water. The band was smooth and perfectly round, with no decorations or engravings visible. What was really strange was that the ring felt warm, even through the glass of the display case. David found himself staring at it, feeling an odd sense of familiarity, like he'd seen it somewhere before in a dream. "Ah, you have excellent taste," said the shopkeeper, who had quietly appeared beside him. David hadn't heard him approach. "That piece is very special, very old." "How old?" David asked, surprised by his own interest. The old man smiled mysteriously. "Older than you might think. It came from a collection I acquired many years ago. The previous owner said it had been in his family for generations, passed down from grandfather to grandson." David looked at the price tag. $55. For what appeared to be a well-made ring, that seemed reasonable. He wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to it in a way that didn't make logical sense. Could I try it on? He asked. Of course. The shopkeeper unlocked the case and carefully lifted out the ring. Here, give me your hand. As soon as the ring touched David's finger, he felt a strange tingling sensation. It wasn't unpleasant, more like the feeling you get when your foot falls asleep, but much gentler. The ring slid on perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for his finger. Perfect fit, the shopkeeper said with a satisfied nod. That's always a good sign. David held up his hand, looking at how the ring caught the light. It felt surprisingly comfortable, like he'd been wearing it for years. The metal was warm against his skin, and he could swear he felt a very faint vibration, almost like a heartbeat. I'll take it, he said, the words coming out before he'd really made a conscious decision. The shopkeeper's smile grew wider. Excellent choice. I had a feeling that ring was waiting for the right person. David paid with his credit card, still feeling a bit surprised by his impulsive purchase. He wasn't usually someone who bought jewelry for himself. The most decorative thing he owned was probably his watch. As he was leaving, David turned back to thank the shopkeeper again, but the man was nowhere to be seen. The shop was completely quiet, and most of the lights seemed to have been turned off. It was as if the place had closed while he was still inside. That was odd, but David figured the old man had probably just stepped into a back room. He pushed, opened the door, and stepped back onto the rainy street. The walk home felt different somehow. The rain didn't seem as cold, and the gray Seattle evening felt less depressing than it had an hour ago. David found himself looking down at the ring frequently, watching how it seemed to catch light even under the dim street lamps. When he got back to his apartment, he tried to remember exactly what the shopkeeper had said about the ring's history. Something about it being passed down through generations. David wondered about all the people who might have worn it before him. Had they been happy? Had they felt the same strange sense of connection to it that he was feeling now? He attempted to take the ring off before going to bed, just to see how it looked on his nightstand. But no matter how he twisted or pulled, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't stuck in a painful way. It just seemed to fit so perfectly that it didn't want to come off. After a few minutes of trying, David decided to just leave it on. It was comfortable enough, and maybe it would be easier to remove in the morning. That night, David had the most vivid dreams he'd experienced in years. He found himself standing in a vast space filled with stars, but somehow he could breathe and move around as if he were walking on solid ground. In the distance, he could see structures that looked like cities made of crystal and light. Beautiful, but definitely not from Earth. When he woke up the next morning, the dream felt more real than most of his actual memories. And the ring was still firmly on his finger, warm and comfortable, as if it belonged there. David had no idea that his simple $55 purchase was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. The next morning, David woke up feeling different. Not sick different, but like someone had upgraded his entire system overnight. The first thing he noticed was how clearly he could see everything in his bedroom. His alarm clock across the room looked sharp and crisp, even though he wasn't wearing his glasses. That was weird. He'd needed glasses for reading since college. He sat up in bed and looked at his hands. The ring was still there, of course, sitting snugly on his finger like it had grown there. In the morning sunlight streaming through his window, it looked even more unusual than it had in the shop. The metal seemed to shift colors slightly as he moved his hand, going from dark gray to almost silver with hints of blue. David tried again to remove the ring, pulling and twisting gently. Nothing. It wasn't hurting him or cutting off circulation. It just wouldn't budge. He'd have to deal with that later. Right now, he needed to get ready for work. In the shower, he noticed something else strange. The water felt different on his skin, like he could sense its temperature and pressure more intensely than usual. And when he accidentally knocked over his shampoo bottle, his hand shot out and caught it before it hit the shower floor. The reaction was so fast and smooth that it surprised him. David had never been particularly athletic or quick with his reflexes. Getting dressed, he found himself craving foods he'd never really wanted before. Instead of his usual toast and coffee, he felt drawn to have a big breakfast with lots of protein and some weird combinations. He ended up making scrambled eggs with spinach and adding some nuts and dried fruit he'd bought months ago but never eaten. It tasted amazing, like his body knew exactly what it needed. The walk to work felt different. 2. Seattle's usual gray morning seemed brighter somehow, and he could hear sounds more clearly. Birds singing, conversations from people half a block away, even the humming of electrical wires overhead. It was like someone had turned up the volume, and clarity on the world around him. At the office, David sat down at his computer and opened up the project he'd been struggling with for weeks. It was a complex piece of software that involved sorting through thousands of data points and organizing them in a way that made sense. Yesterday, it had felt like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Today, it was like the solution was written in bright letters right in front of him. His fingers flew across the keyboard as ideas flowed faster than he could type them. Within 2 hours, he'd solved problems that had been giving him headaches for days. "Whoa, David," said his co-worker Tom from the next desk over. "What did you have for breakfast? You're coding like you're in some kind of zone?" David looked up, realizing he'd been so focused that he hadn't noticed Tom had been watching him work. "Just having a good day, I guess." "Good day? Dude, you just wrote more clean code in 2 hours than most people do in a week. Are you taking some kind of new vitamin or something?" David laughed it off, but privately he was wondering the same thing. This level of focus and clarity wasn't normal for him. He'd always been a decent programmer, but today he felt like he could see patterns and solutions that had been invisible before. During his lunch break, David decided to test something. He went to the building's stairwell and looked up. Their office was on the 8th floor, and he'd always gotten a bit winded climbing more than a few flights of stairs. Today, he jogged up all 8 flights without breaking a sweat. His heart rate barely increased, and his breathing stayed normal. That evening, David tried researching the ring online. He searched for antique jewelry, unusual metals, and even rings that won't come off. Nothing he found looked anything like what he was wearing. Most of the search results were about medical conditions or getting stuck rings removed, neither of which seemed to apply to his situation. He also tried to find information about the shop where he'd bought it. He drove back to the same street and walked up and down looking for ancient wonders. The coffee shop was there, and so was the vintage clothing store. But between them was just a narrow alley filled with dumpsters and old boxes. There was no sign that a shop had ever been there. David even asked the barista at the coffee shop if she'd ever seen an antique store in the area. "Antique store?" she said, looking confused. "There's never been any store between us and Retro Dreams. That's just been an alley for as long as I've worked here, and that's been 3 years. This was getting seriously weird. David was starting to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing, except for the ring on his finger that definitely existed. That night, the dreams came back, but they were even more vivid than before. He found himself in what looked like a vast library, but instead of books, the shelves were filled with glowing crystals of different sizes and colors. Somehow he knew that each crystal contained knowledge, entire lifetimes of learning and experience stored in solid form. In the dream, he wasn't alone. There were other beings moving through the library, tall and graceful with skin that seemed to shimmer like the surface of water. They communicated without speaking, sharing thoughts and ideas directly from mind to mind. One of them noticed David and approached him, but instead of fear, he felt a sense of recognition, like meeting an old friend after a long time apart. When David woke up, he could remember every detail of the dream. Usually his dreams faded within minutes of waking up, leaving only vague impressions. But this one stayed crystal clear in his memory, as real as his actual experiences. Over the next few days, the changes continued to develop. His vision kept getting sharper, to the point where he didn't need his glasses at all anymore. His reflexes were becoming almost superhuman. He could catch falling objects without thinking, and his typing speed had doubled. He was craving specific foods, particularly ones high in certain minerals he'd never paid attention to before. The most unsettling change was happening to his apartment. Every morning, he'd wake up to find strange patterns on his windows, geometric designs that looked like they'd been traced in frost, even though it was still relatively warm outside. The patterns were incredibly complex and beautiful, like mathematical equations written in an artistic form. But whenever he touched the glass, they would fade away within seconds. David started taking pictures of the patterns with his phone, but they never showed up clearly in the photos. It was as if they existed on a wavelength that digital cameras couldn't capture properly. He tried to research the symbols online, comparing them to various alphabets and mathematical notations. Some of them reminded him of circuit diagrams, others looked like star charts or molecular structures. But nothing matched exactly, and he couldn't find any reference to similar patterns appearing on windows. The ring itself was becoming more active. Throughout the day, David would notice it warming up slightly, and sometimes he could swear he felt a gentle pulsing sensation, like it had its own heartbeat. Late at night, if he looked closely in a dark room, he could see a very faint blue glow emanating from the metal. At work, his enhanced abilities were starting to attract attention. His boss had praised his recent productivity, and other programmers were asking him for advice on projects they were struggling with. David found himself able to see solutions to coding problems that would have taken him days to figure out before. But, along with the improvements came a growing sense of unease. These weren't normal changes that happened to people. Normal people didn't suddenly develop perfect vision or superhuman reflexes from wearing a piece of jewelry. Normal people didn't have mathematical equations appearing on their windows every morning. David was beginning to suspect that the ring wasn't just an unusual antique. Something much stranger was happening to him, and he had no idea what it meant or where it was leading. All he knew was that his life had taken a turn into territory. That felt more like science fiction than reality. The problem was, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to stop. Whatever was happening to him, it felt like he was becoming a better version of himself, smarter, faster, more capable than he'd ever been. But it also felt like he was moving away from being entirely human, and that thought both excited and terrified him. As he lay in bed each night, feeling the ring's gentle warmth against his skin, David wondered what other changes were coming. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he had the strange feeling that something or someone was trying to communicate with him through these experiences. He just didn't know how to listen yet. 2 weeks after buying the ring, David's life had become something he barely recognized. The changes were happening faster now, and he was starting to feel like he was living in two different worlds at the same time. During the day, he went through the motions of his normal life. Work, grocery shopping, trying to maintain some sense of routine. But at night, his dreams had become so vivid and detailed that they felt more real than his waking hours. It was a Tuesday evening when everything changed completely. David had just finished dinner and was sitting on his couch trying to focus on a TV show when the ring started behaving differently than it ever had before. Instead of the gentle warmth he'd grown used to, it began to pulse with a stronger rhythm, almost like it was trying to sync up with his heartbeat. The pulsing grew stronger, and suddenly the ring was glowing with a bright blue light that filled his entire living room. David held up his hand, watching in amazement as the light seemed to dance and swirl around his fingers. It wasn't hot or painful. In fact, it felt cool and soothing, like diving into a calm lake on a summer day. Then something incredible happened. The air in front of him began to shimmer and bend, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But instead of distortion, the shimmering formed into shapes, colors, and finally into the clearest image David had ever seen. Standing in his living room, but somehow not quite there, was a person unlike anyone he'd ever encountered. She was tall, probably close to 7 feet, with skin that looked like it was made of polished silver mixed with the colors you see in soap bubbles. Her features were elegant and sharp, but not in a harsh way, more like someone had taken the idea of human beauty and refined it into something otherworldly. But it was her eyes that really caught David's attention. They were large and expressive, shifting between deep blue and violet, and they held an intelligence that seemed ancient and kind at the same time. David's first instinct was to jump up and run, but something about her presence felt calming rather than threatening. She seemed to be waiting patiently for him to process what he was seeing. "Please don't be afraid," she said, and her voice was the strangest part of all. David could hear her words clearly, but he realized her lips weren't moving. The voice was coming from inside his own mind, gentle and warm like a friend speaking directly to his thoughts. "I know this must be very confusing for you. My name is Zara, and I am from a place very far from your Earth. The ring you are wearing belongs to my people, and by putting it on, you have created a connection between us." David found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. You're not human." Zara's expression softened, and David could somehow sense that she was smiling, even though her facial features didn't quite work the same way as human expressions. "No, I am not. I am what your people might call an alien, though we prefer to think of ourselves simply as beings from another world. We call ourselves the Katorians." Over the next hour, Zara patiently explained things that turned David's understanding of reality completely upside down. The ring wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a bonding device used by her people to connect compatible individuals across vast distances. It had been lost on Earth hundreds of years ago when one of their exploration ships had visited this solar system. "We have been searching for it for a very long time," Zara explained. "Not just because it is valuable to us, but because it carries a deep personal meaning. In our culture, these bonding rings are created specifically for two individuals who are meant to be life partners. This particular ring was made for me." David felt his heart skip a beat. "Life partners? You mean like marriage?" In a way, yes. When two people are bonded through these rings, they become connected not just emotionally, but spiritually and mentally as well. They share thoughts, feelings, and experiences. It is the deepest form of relationship possible among our people. The implications of what she was saying began to sink in. "So when I put on this ring, you became bonded to me, yes. That is why you have been experiencing changes. The ring is slowly adapting your human physiology to accommodate our connection. The enhanced abilities you've noticed, the vivid dreams, the strange patterns, these are all signs that the bonding process is working." David sat back down heavily, on his couch, trying to process this information. "But I didn't know any of this when I bought it. I just thought it was a nice ring." Zara's presence seemed to move closer, and David could feel a sense of understanding and compassion coming from her. "I know, and I am sorry that you were not given a choice in this matter. The bonding should only happen when both individuals consent to it. But the ring recognizes compatible souls, and it seems to have found something in you that matches with me." "What does this mean for both of us?" David asked. Zara was quiet for a moment, and David could sense that this was a difficult topic for her as well. "Among my people, bonding is considered sacred and permanent. Once two individuals are connected in this way, they are expected to share their lives together. But your situation is unique. You are human, and you live on a world that my people have not yet made official contact with." She went on to explain that she was currently aboard a research vessel positioned in the outer part of Earth's solar system. Her people had been studying human civilization for years, preparing for eventual first contact, but that process was expected to take many more years of careful planning. "I have been searching for my bonding ring for 3 of your Earth years," Zara continued. "When I felt its activation 2 weeks ago, I was overjoyed but also concerned. I never expected it to bond with someone who was not of my people." David looked down at the ring, which was still glowing softly. "Can it be removed? Can this bonding thing be undone?" "It is possible, but it is a complex process that can take many years. And to be honest with you, David, I do not wish for it to be undone." This surprised him. "Why not?" "Because in these 2 weeks of connection I have experienced more joy and wonder than I have felt in decades. Through our bond, I have been able to see and feel your world through your eyes. I have experienced human emotions and perspectives that are new to me. Your species has a capacity for creativity and resilience that is remarkable." David felt a strange warmth in his chest that he realized wasn't coming from himself. It was Zara's emotions, flowing through their connection. "You can feel what I feel? Yes, and you can feel what I feel, though you may not have realized it yet. The connection grows stronger over time. Eventually, we would be able to share memories, experiences, even dreams." As if to demonstrate, David suddenly found himself seeing flashes of images that weren't from his own life. He saw vast spaces, filled with stars, cities that looked like they were made of crystal and light, and beings like Zara moving through environments that were beautiful but completely alien. "Those are my memories," Zara explained gently. "My homeworld, my people, the ship I live on now." David felt overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening to him. 2 weeks ago, his biggest problem had been a breakup and a rejected work project. Now he was apparently bonded to an alien being and connected to civilizations beyond Earth. "I need time to think about all this," he said finally. "Of course, this is a lot to understand, and I do not expect you to make any decisions quickly. But David, I want you to know that I am grateful for this connection, even though it happened by accident. In my long life, I have never felt as complete as I have these past 2 weeks." As Zara's image began to fade, she left him with one final thought. "We can communicate like this whenever the ring is active. If you focus on it and think of me, I will know, and I can reach out to you. You are not alone in this, David. Whatever we decide about our future, we will figure it out together." When she was gone, David sat in his darkened living room for hours, staring at the ring and trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. His quiet, ordinary life had just become part of something cosmic and incredible. He was bonded to someone from another world, someone who had been searching for him without even knowing he existed. The scariest part wasn't that his life had become strange and unpredictable. The scariest part was that despite all the uncertainty and impossibility of the situation, he was beginning to care about Zara, and through their connection he could feel that she cared about him too. David had bought a simple ring thinking it might make him feel less alone. He had no idea it would connect him to someone who was literally worlds away, but who might be exactly what he'd been looking for his entire life. Over the next 3 weeks, David's life developed a completely new routine. During the day, he would go to work and try to act normal, though his enhanced abilities were making it harder to blend in. His co-workers had started calling him the machine because of how quickly he could solve complex programming problems. His boss had already mentioned the possibility of a promotion, something that would have thrilled him a month ago, but now seemed almost trivial. The real part of his life began each evening when he would sit quietly in his apartment and focus on the ring. Within minutes, Zara would appear in that shimmering, translucent way, and they would spend hours talking about everything imaginable. David learned that Zara was actually over 200 years old, though she looked like she might be in her 30s by human standards. Her people lived much longer than humans, and they aged very slowly. She was a scientist specializing in what she called cultural integration, studying how different species could learn to understand and communicate with each other. That's actually why I was chosen for this mission to your solar system, she explained during one of their conversations. My job is to help my people understand human culture and psychology so that when we eventually make official contact, it will go smoothly. How long have you been watching us? David asked. Our people have been observing Earth for about 50 of your years, but I have only been part of the research team for the last 10. We've been fascinated by how quickly your species develops and changes. Most civilizations we encounter remain fairly stable for thousands of years, but humans are constantly creating new technologies, art, and ways of thinking. Through their nightly conversations, David began to understand just how complex his situation really was. The bonding ring wasn't just connecting him to Zara personally, it was creating a link that had legal and social implications in Katorian society. Among my people, bonding is taken very seriously, Zara explained. When two individuals are bonded, their families become connected as well. Their careers, their living situations, everything becomes shared. It's not just like your human marriage, it's a complete joining of two lives. David felt a knot form in his stomach. What does that mean for us? Well, according to our laws and customs, we should be living together within one solar cycle of the bonding. Since we are now connected, I am expected to either bring you to live with my people, or I should come to Earth to be with you. But your people haven't made contact with Earth yet. How would that even work? Zara's expression grew troubled. That's the problem we're facing. The High Council of my ship has been debating this situation for days. Some of them think the bonding should be dissolved because it was accidental and because you're not Katorian. Others believe that the bond is sacred regardless of how it happened and should be honored. David learned that there was a third group who wanted to use this situation as an opportunity to accelerate their first contact plans with Earth. They think that having a human who is already bonded to one of us could make the introduction process easier for both our species. What do you think should happen? David asked. Zara was quiet for a long moment. I know what my heart wants, but I also know how complicated this situation is for you. You didn't choose this, David. You were just living your normal life when you accidentally picked up something that changed everything. But the truth was, David was beginning to realize that his feelings about the situation were becoming more complicated too. At first, the whole thing had felt like a bizarre accident that he wanted to undo. But spending time with Zara each evening had become the highlight of his day. She was intelligent, funny, and kind in ways that made him feel understood in a way he'd never experienced before. Can I ask you something personal? David said one evening. Of course. Before this happened, were you lonely? I mean, did you have close relationships with people? Zara's emotional response came through their connection before her words did. A deep sadness mixed with longing. Yes, I was very lonely. Our society is quite formal and structured. We have colleagues and acquaintances, but deep personal connections are rare. The bonding process is supposed to solve that, but finding one's intended partner can take many years, sometimes centuries. I was lonely too, David admitted. Even when I was with my ex-girlfriend, I felt like something was missing. Like I was going through the motions of having a relationship without really connecting with someone. And now? Zara asked gently. David thought about it carefully. Now I feel more connected to you than I ever felt to anyone in my life, and we've never even been in the same room. Their conversations weren't just about serious topics. David found himself laughing more than he had in years as Zara shared stories about life on her ship and her observations about human behavior. She was particularly fascinated by human entertainment. I have been studying your movies and television programs through our monitoring systems, she said one evening. I am very confused by something called reality television. The people on These shows seem to be competing for things they don't actually need while being deliberately cruel to each other. Is this truly representative of human behavior? David laughed so hard he nearly fell off his couch. No, definitely not representative. Most humans think those shows are pretty ridiculous, too. Oh, thank goodness. I was beginning to worry about your species. But their lighthearted moments were balanced by serious discussions about their future. David learned that the physical changes he was experiencing were permanent. The enhanced vision, reflexes, and mental abilities were the result of the bonding process, literally altering his biology to make him compatible with Katorian physiology. If we were to dissolve the bond, you would keep most of these abilities, Zara explained, but you would also experience a kind of emptiness that might be very difficult to handle. Bonded individuals who are separated often become depressed and find it hard to form connections with others. What about you? What would happen to you if we ended this? The same, but potentially worse. I am older and have been alone longer. The bonding has awakened feelings and experiences that I never expected to have. Losing that connection would be devastating. David was also learning practical things about what life with the Katorians would be like if he chose to join them. Their ship was enormous, more like a floating city than anything humans had built. They had artificial environments that could simulate different climates and landscapes, advanced medical technology that could extend human life significantly, and access to knowledge and experiences from dozens of different worlds. But, Zara warned him, you would essentially be leaving Earth forever. Our people travel constantly, exploring new systems and studying different civilizations. We might not return to this area of space for many decades. What about if you stayed on Earth with me? I would be cutting myself off from my people, my career, and everything I've known for 2 centuries. It would be a complete life change for me as well. The weight of these decisions was enormous, but David found that he was no longer feeling overwhelmed by them. Instead, he was beginning to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time: excitement about the future. Zara, he said one evening, can I see more of your memories? I want to understand what life with your people would really be like. Are you sure? Some of what I've experienced might be overwhelming for a human mind. I'm sure. What followed was the most incredible experience of David's life. Through their connection, Zara shared memories of standing on the observation deck of her ship and watching entire galaxies wheel by in the darkness of space. He experienced the sensation of walking through cities made of living crystal that responded to the inhabitants' thoughts and emotions. He felt what it was like to communicate with beings so different from humans that they existed as pure energy rather than physical forms. But perhaps most importantly, he experienced Zara's memories of loneliness, centuries of working alongside others but never truly connecting with anyone. He felt her joy when the bonding ring first activated and she realized she was no longer alone in the universe. When the sharing ended, David sat quietly for a long time, processing everything he had experienced. That was incredible, he finally said. But also terrifying. Your world is so much bigger than anything I've ever imagined. It can be overwhelming, Zara agreed. But it can also be wonderful to be part of something larger than yourself. To know that you're connected to an entire universe full of life and possibility. As their conversation ended that evening, David realized that he was no longer thinking about whether he wanted this bonding to continue. He was starting to think about how to make it work. The question was no longer whether he cared about Zara, but whether he was brave enough to completely change his life for love and adventure, beyond his wildest dreams. The moment of decision came on a quiet Sunday morning, 6 weeks after David had first put on the ring. He was sitting in his favorite coffee shop, watching people walk by on the street, when Zara's voice came through their connection with unusual urgency. David, I need to speak with you immediately. Something important has happened. He quickly paid for his coffee and hurried home. As soon as he focused on the ring, Zara appeared, but her usual calm demeanor was replaced by obvious stress. The Tigway High Council has made their decision about our situation, she said without preamble. They're not going to force us to dissolve the bond, but they're also not willing to change their first contact timeline with Earth. David felt his heart sink. What does that mean for us? It means we have to choose, and we have to choose soon. I can either request permission to leave the ship and come to Earth permanently, or you can agree to be brought aboard our vessel and become part of our community. How long do we have to decide? 2 weeks. The Council feels that leaving this situation unresolved any longer would be unfair to both of us and potentially disruptive to our mission. David sank into his couch, feeling the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. What happens if you come to Earth? Zara's expression grew sad. I would essentially be exiled from my people. The Council would arrange for me to be left on Earth with enough resources to survive, but I would have no contact with Katorian society. I would be giving up my career, my family, and any possibility of returning to the life I've known for 2 centuries. And if I go with you, you would be welcomed as a full member of our community. Our medical technology could extend your natural lifespan to match mine, so we could truly spend our lives together. You would have access to knowledge and experiences beyond anything possible on Earth. But you would be leaving your world, your family, your entire species behind. Over the next few days, David found himself agonizing over the decision in ways he'd never experienced before. He made lists of pros and cons, but they seemed meaningless when compared to the enormity of what he was choosing between. He thought about his life on Earth. His job was going well, better than ever thanks to his enhanced abilities. He had friends, though none he was particularly close to. His family lived across the country, and he only saw them a few times a year. His ex-girlfriend had already moved on and was dating someone new. When he really examined it honestly, David realized that his life on Earth was comfortable but not particularly fulfilling. He'd been going through the motions for years, waiting for something meaningful to happen. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most meaningful thing that had ever happened to him was this accidental connection to someone from another world. But leaving Earth forever was terrifying. It meant giving up everything familiar, everything safe and predictable. It meant trusting that life with Zara and her people would be worth abandoning the only world he'd ever known. I need to understand something, David said during one of their conversations. If I come with you, what would my life actually be like day to day? Zara spent the next several evenings giving him detailed descriptions of life aboard their ship. The Katorians lived in a highly advanced but peaceful society. There was no poverty, no war, no environmental destruction. Everyone contributed according to their abilities and interests, working on projects that benefited the community and expanded their understanding of the universe. Your skills with computers and logical thinking would be very valuable to us, Zara explained. We could use your help in developing better ways to understand and communicate with the species we encounter. Your human perspective would be unique and important. But would I be accepted? Would other Katorians see me as an equal or as some kind of curiosity? There might be some who view you as unusual at first, but our society values diversity and new perspectives. Once they got to know you, I believe you would be welcomed and respected. David also learned more about what their relationship would be like. Katorian bonding was deeper than human marriage in some ways, but also different. Bonded pairs were expected to support and complement each other, but they also maintained individual identities and pursuits. We would share living space and make important decisions together, but you would still be free to pursue your own interests and friendships, Zara explained. The bond creates connection, not dependence. As the deadline approached, David realized that his biggest fear wasn't about leaving Earth or adapting to alien society. His biggest fear was that he was falling in love with someone he'd never actually touched, and he was terrified that the physical reality of being together might not match the incredible emotional and mental connection they'd developed. Zara, he said one evening, What if we meet in person and discover that this connection doesn't work the same way when we're actually together? Her response came with a wave of warmth and understanding through their bond. I have the same fear, David, but I also know that what we have is real. I've never experienced anything like this connection with anyone else in over 200 years of life. Even if the physical reality is different from what we expect, the emotional and spiritual bond we share is genuine. 3 days before the deadline, David made his decision. He was sitting in his apartment late at night, looking around at all his possessions and trying to imagine leaving them all behind when he realized something important. None of these things, his furniture, his books, his gadgets, mattered to him as much as his evening conversations with Zara. Over the past 6 weeks, she had become the most important part of his life. The thought of losing that connection, of going back to his old lonely existence, was unbearable. More than that, the idea of exploring the universe with someone who understood him better than anyone ever had was the most exciting prospect he could imagine. I've made my choice, he told Zara the next evening. And I want to come with you. I want to see what life can be like when you're truly connected to someone who cares about you. I want to help your people understand humans, and I want to learn about all the incredible things that exist beyond Earth. The joy that flowed through their connection was overwhelming. David felt tears in his eyes as he experienced Zara's happiness mixing with his own. Are you absolutely certain? She asked. Once you're aboard our ship, there will be no way to return to Earth for many years, possibly decades. I'm certain. My life here has been fine, but it's never been extraordinary. What you're offering me is a chance to be part of something amazing, and to do it with someone David paused, realizing he was about to say something he'd never said to another person, and meant it completely. Someone I love. I love you too, David. I know it seems impossible to love someone you've never met in person, but what we share goes deeper than physical presence. The logistics of David's departure were surprisingly complex. The Katorians couldn't simply beam him up to their ship like in science fiction movies. Instead, they would need to send a small transport vessel to Earth, which would require careful planning to avoid detection by human governments and space monitoring systems. David would need to disappear from his life on Earth in a way that didn't cause alarm or investigation. With Zara's help, he crafted a story about accepting a job with a remote research station in Antarctica, somewhere his friends and family would expect to have limited communication with him. He quit his job, sold most of his possessions, and transferred his remaining money to a savings account that would continue to make automatic payments on his apartment lease for several months. To anyone who knew him, it would look like he had simply taken a job that required him to be out of contact for an extended period. The night before the transport was scheduled to arrive, David sat in his nearly empty apartment, taking one last look at the life he was leaving behind. He felt nervous and excited and terrified all at the same time. Any second thoughts? Zara asked gently. David looked down at the ring that had started this entire incredible journey. No second thoughts, just amazement that a $55 impulse purchase could change my entire life. Not just your life, Zara said. You've changed my life too, in ways I never expected. Tomorrow, we begin a completely new adventure together. The next evening, David stood in an empty field outside the city, holding a small bag with the few personal items he'd decided to bring with him. Above him, the stars looked different than they ever had before, not like distant lights, but like destinations waiting to be explored. When the Katorian transport ship appeared, hovering silently above the field, David felt a moment of pure wonder. It was sleek and beautiful, clearly built by a civilization far more advanced than anything on Earth. As he stepped aboard and left Earth's surface for the first time in his life, David Rodriguez realized that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that scare you the most. He was leaving everything familiar behind, but he was gaining something extraordinary, a true partner, a purpose, and access to wonders beyond imagination. The simple ring he'd bought on a whim had indeed turned out to be an alien marriage bond. But more than that, it had turned out to be the key to the life he'd always dreamed of, but never thought possible. As the transport carried him toward Zara and their shared future among the stars, David smiled and touched the ring that had changed.